All right, folks, welcome back. We're ready for panel number one. I'm so excited to bring to you today some amazing panelists that are going to be speaking about cultivating a healthy mind, body, and spirit during COVID, fears, facts, and fiction. Reverend Willard Ashley is one of our leading psychoanalysts at CUNY Medical School and has been a part of our family for the CUNY family for a while. And so he's going to be leading this conversation. Reverend Ashley, thank you for being here with us today. So delighted to have you. I'm going to turn it over to you to take it from here, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you very much. We're excited because this is a very needed and necessary conversation, and it's an important conversation. So just so we all keep focused, it's cultivating a healthy mind, body, and spirit during COVID, fears, facts, and fiction. And our panelists today, we're going to focus on looking at our views on the new normal. And now many of us have questions about COVID, the vaccines, the impact on our lives, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, and talking to people who are on the ground that are wrestling with these public health issues on a regular basis. So we have three wonderful panelists. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce himself, say this a little bit about the work that you do. Then we're going to jump right into the conversation. Peter, let me start with you.
Morning, Reverend Ashley and fellow panelists and everyone watching. My name is Peter Santiago, and I'm the Associate Director of the Accessibility Services Program at Kingsborough. What I do there is I help to provide equitable access to students' abilities. And I also work in private practice as a licensed mental health counselor. And I've been working with folks all throughout the pandemic, and I've heard a lot of horrendous stories and a lot of trauma. And I'm hoping that being part of this conversation will help some of the people that are watching to resolve some of their trauma and some of the issues that they may be going through.
Thank you so much, Peter. Bakari?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bakari Levy, and good morning to you, Reverend Ashley. By trade, I am a software engineer. I currently work at Nationwide in the infrastructure division. And in the infrastructure division, what we basically do is we help provide hardware, so computers, workstations, things of that nature, across the whole entire company so that people could transition from working in the office to working at home. Currently, I am also engaging in human rights and foreign policy research in Colombia at La Javeriana University. So I'm excited to be here, and hopefully I can share a perspective that is going to be a mixture of both working in corporate as well as looking at, different ways that other countries have adapted.
Great. Thank you so much. And Kahlil, did I pronounce it right?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, Reverend Ashley and everyone attending. Peter, Bakari, good morning. My name is Kahlil Yard. I am the program director of the CUNY Fatherhood Academy here at Kingsborough. We are a program for young fathers between 18 and 30, primarily helping them work on getting their high school equivalency. But we do also have a track for those who are interested in college and career, but getting them to look at their lives, not just on the educational, but for their personal development and for their role as father, both in their family and community. So just looking at how that population of young men can be affected and has been affected by this pandemic and these topics that we're going to discuss today.
Great. So again, we are blessed to have these three excellent panelists who are doing work on the ground. It's not just theory. We're having to deal with this on a regular basis. We had this wonderful conversation in the pre-meeting. Hope we can capture some of that energy in this time together. And so what we want to do is let's put this all in context. We're concerned about the pandemic. We're concerned about COVID. But we were talking about in our pre-meeting about placing it in the proper context, the larger context of wellness. And how does that impact us as Black men in particular, and in our Black and Latinx communities? So you want to kind of set the stage and talk about the larger context, then we'll drill down into more deeper specifics.
Sounds great. Would you mind if I jump in?
Jump in, please.
All right. Okay. So I think, Reverend Ashley, you made a perfect point that we have to think about it bigger than, right? I think right now we're at a space where people are feeding both information and misinformation and disinformation all into the same structure and system, and then we're trying to do our best to navigate that as people. And I think what that happens is we start to ignore other aspects and areas of our health and our well-being, right? Where we're not seeing how the physical repercussions of this pandemic then affect our emotional and social health. How being inside, we turn to our phones and our computers more, or substances, or whatever it may be. And those have larger impacts. And I think when we look at the health disparities already present, specifically in the Black and Latinx communities, this is a compounding variable that we have to have real, honest, vulnerable conversations about with each other.
Sounds great. Peter, Bakari, you want to add to that, build on top of it?
Well, I think that was well said, Kamal. And, I totally agree that on top of things that folks had to deal with pre-pandemic, we have all these additional, issues and, like unemployment, isolation, social isolation, which has, been very prevalent and something that is one of the worst determinants of health outcomes is social isolation. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, Peter, that you connected the concept of wellness, not just from the perspective of the individual, but also to the community and society at large, because there's a tendency in enterprise to think in very linear terms. So, for example, during the transition to working from office to working at home, there was a big effort for Nationwide to try and encourage, well, we want optimal working conditions for the individual. We want people, now that they are working from home, that they can, they should be able to put more hours in. They should be more flexible. We should have more access to our employees. And when we think about things from the context of wellness, and we think about the impact that that has on not just the the workers of corporation or company X, the wellness piece is critical, because as a community we have to face all these problems, and if the main means by which we subsist our lives is encouraging more and more work, because okay, well, our workers are at home, so there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to put in an extra 2 hours to come in early, or it shouldn't be much of a problem if I reach out to them 8 o'clock at night. When we talk about wellness and we talk about the mental and physical impact of that, that is, very relevant to the discussion of work. And I also like the fact that you connected the point, Peter, that right now, because of the challenges of the pandemic, it's leading to less work. So what does it mean for, Black and Latinx communities who have, when people are not able to access the same levels of resources, when they have less opportunities? When we talk about wellness, we have to also consider those social and larger impacts of, corporate decision making, as well as, finances in that aspect.
So thank you. So when you put that out there, it brings to mind a four-letter word. And being I'm the preacher, I'm not supposed to use four-letter words. But I'm going to use a four-letter word: race. And racism. And it seems as though the pandemic has exposed the disparities, and at least in my neighborhood, the racism. Am I on the right page with that, or is that just where I live?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, looking at the shift in work and the shift in terms of, corporate has consistently been going on a pace of globalization and automation of work. And what does that mean for Black and Latinx communities who may not have the equity of access to educational opportunities, and they can't take advantage of those higher salaries, right? So when you bring up the race point, I think that, the corporate answer would be like, okay, well, we want to promote diversity, and we want to hire more African American and Latino, workers. But the problem with that is, well, if in the community they don't have the means to the educational resources, access to experts in the field. What does that mean for someone living in Brownsville that Nationwide wants to increase its diversity quotient, or any company really, and yet they are not connecting to the actual social issues endemic to Brownsville, for example?
Excellent.
I think it's also important to note that those people from our Black and Brown communities that are working are primarily working in, the frontline fields, right? So they've been going out to work every day during this pandemic and dealing with the stress and the toil and toll that it takes on a person to risk, getting sick, and then potentially bringing that home to the family. And so this is an additional level of stress, even for those that are working, that the work is dangerous or could be dangerous to them.
Yeah, it's good news, bad news, right? Good news, I have a job. Bad news, I have a job.
Well,
Correct.
I'm happy you brought that up, Peter, because it was very interesting in the early days, this concept of essential workers, and who was deemed essential. And oddly enough, some of the people who weren't necessarily related to with that lens of essentialness are from Black and Brown communities. Your store shelves that you expected to be stocked, or even now the gig economy, we're asking people to take on more risk for the comforts of those who have more access without then still providing that same amount of resource back. And that then expounds all the other things, right, that we're talking about from a physical health, a mental health, and an emotional health perspective. If you've worked through this whole thing, how do you connect with your family member who worked from home? How do you ingest information and material about, your quote unquote risk during the pandemic, or your need to be vaccinated, where you're like, I've been outside this whole time and I think I'm safe. You've been inside and you're telling me I'm unsafe. And what does that then create, in terms of our dynamics with each other? Because we are communal and social beings. So, I mean, that was a great point. And within our community, not only that, but the combined effect of all of us experiencing the same trauma at the same time, in regards to injustice at the hands of police and our government, and watching the myriad responses to, as we talk about race, right? White responses to quote unquote oppression in light of this pandemic. So I think that's even another layer in terms of our social emotional health of, I have to now go back into these spaces and move through this world as if around me, I'm not seeing these things and it affects me one way, but the larger society may not see it that way.
You are totally on target with that. And I know, Peter, you and I as mental health providers need to come up with codes so we can get paid. There's no code for racial trauma. It's not in the DSM-5. And I don't know about you, but my patients come in saying, I'm traumatized, I'm exhausted, I'm fatigued. And I can force fit it somewhere. But the real issue is to say, I'm just tired of the racism. It has just worn me out. And I'm using the cleaned up version. So and so, when we talk about wellness, all three of you are correct. That's a layer that the larger society doesn't fully appreciate, that Black and Latinx people are having to experience. So before we get to the cure, so to speak, or how we deal with it, let's drill down just a little bit deeper, because we were talking before about one of the frustrations and challenges is, in light of this, how do we process information?
Well, I can say as an engineer by trade, well, for one, currently the most valuable asset in the world is considered to be data by price, right? Now, the interesting piece of that is, there's this whole concept within engineering of big data, and it's not so much relevant, what the specific data is, but the insights you can draw. So when you talk about the issue of, how can we discern information, a lot of corporations and firms are pushing, and not even just, the private sector, but also like, just when you look at the dynamics of international relations, there is a push to provide information, and it doesn't necessarily have to be accurate, right? The main thing is that if I can create a piece of information and have it propagate on the internet, whether about the vaccine, for example, like, we may say that, this vaccine is 97% effective. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but the value in that data is not the truth, whether it's, empirically true that this vaccine is 97% effective and has no side effects, or false. It just matters. There is value simply in it being out there. And how do we discern when there are so many organizations, and there are so many individuals who are trying to put information out into mass consumption through platforms like maybe Facebook, through platforms like, Instagram and TikTok. And, what I like to look at in terms of trying to discern the truth about situations, you have to really ask yourself, well, if it's coming from this source, if it's coming from this organization, who stands to benefit from, this organization? And, when we think about the vaccine, the importance of it, because I do have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, I took that measure, of course, because I'm engaging in currently international studies and research. However, we can't get around the fact that, there are plenty of reasons why Johnson & Johnson would want to fund, public-facing organizations who provide information about, the safeness of this vaccine, and also who will provide information about, the efficacy of the vaccine. I think there was just recently an article that came out regarding one of the major sources that was on Facebook as a platform that was paying for ad space. So in the attention of everyone on this call who uses Facebook, they were seeing posts regarding, the efficacy of the vaccine, and the organization is a nonprofit organization that is supposed to, give information about health. Now, the problem is, if Johnson & Johnson is funding this organization, and, they want the information out there because they want the attention space of individuals, then, what does that really mean? Is it really, as effective as it says? So I think that's the big problem of discernment, is trying to identify who stands to benefit from what information, and, what organizations are allied with each other.
Exactly. And, for whatever reason, we don't evaluate the sources for the most part, and we don't engage in information literacy. It's on the internet, it's in a book, it's in an article, it must be true.
Yeah, exactly.
What else?
And I think one other matter, and Bakari, you touched on this, is just the sheer amount of information. So how do you wade through all of this information that's out there? And, you have companies, you have your friends, you have family, you have all different sources of information that are coming in at the same time. And how do you even absorb that information and then discern? So that's an additional problem that we're facing, in that, many folks have several social media accounts. So it's not just Facebook, it's Facebook, then Instagram, then Twitter, then, whatever other platforms folks are on. And that drilling down becomes even more difficult. I think something else that exacerbates this is that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? I mean, it's only over the past 20 years that we had this wealth of information available to us. So, along with that needs to come the education, so that folks can discern between that information, if they're even able to absorb it all, or to train, to teach folks how to find reputable sources, right? Sources that they can trust and that they can go back to in times when there's too much information or misinformation.
Absolutely. Being that we're New Yorkers, we used to walk to the library, right? And you talked to the librarian and helped you figure out the credible sources. Now at 2 o'clock in the morning, people are doing homework on the internet and not checking and double checking those sources and who funded this study, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. No, I think that's the most critical point is how do people define their trusted sources? And how many sources do they have? I think another thing with our current, just space and time when it comes to how we interact on social media and exchange information on all these platforms, we don't understand the algorithms. So we don't understand how, like Bakari perfectly said, data is valuable. So we're not understanding how not only are we shopping, but being shopped to when we think we're just scrolling. We're just having fun on no, somebody is like, oh, you like this? Here's more. Keep clicking, keep going, right? And how that can take you down a rabbit hole where how do you then process, salvage, change this information, or go look for others? Like when you were a kid and you wrote a paper, you couldn't just write the paper on one book. That's not a paper. That's a book report. It's a different thing. You didn't research. You didn't go back and say, oh, maybe there's another argument here that I'm missing. And then the last piece is that it makes us antagonistic towards each other. And that creates further detriment and isolation because we're not really having a conversation. I just want to prove you wrong so you could say that my source is right and your source is wrong, instead of saying, oh, I didn't even think about that perspective. How does that correlate to what I'm bringing to the table? And maybe we can find the truth somehow in that. So that's another piece too that we have to really interrogate.
And that's a challenge and a frustration, this whole issue of trusted sources, because I'm hearing people say, well, yeah, my internist said this, my pastor, imam, rabbi said this, but prophet so-and-so said this. And I'm going to listen to that person, not the people I've been with for a lifetime. Has that been part of your experience? And I'm not picking on prophets. I'm the preacher person, so I'm just saying the trusted sources piece.
Well, I would say I think the way in which content creation has become an industry has hurt a lot of younger people. Okay. Some older people, but more younger people, because they really begin to build identities around these content creators. I follow so-and-so and they say this is how you should live, so I must live this way. Instead of I follow so-and-so, they have some great information. And so, I may go look up where they got theirs from or figure out how it fits into my life. But that's not what it is. I'm going to build my entire identity around this. And you do also see that in some religious sectors too. I have to build my entirety around this thing. And that I think can be dangerous.
I like that point. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Oh, no, you go ahead, Bakari.
No, I was just going to say, I think that that point is absolutely critical, right? Because what we really, I think what both Reverend Ashley and Kahlil are touching on is like this issue of trust, right? When you're looking at like trusted sources, it's great that, like Kahlil would say, it's great that you're getting your information from an influencer. But if the doctor that lives in your community that's been tending to your family for maybe 2 generations, why wouldn't you ask that doctor about, is this vaccine effective? What are the risks? This is what person X said on Instagram from your perspective as a professional working in the field who has tended to this community. What is your opinion on this? And I think when we connect the dots of how we process information and how are we getting to that path of wellness, despite the fact that there may be, more equitable access to information, we need to then turn to the resources of our communities and the experts of our communities and try and bridge that gap of understanding, right? Like, it's great that, we have a whole generation looking at social media because now there's more information they can access. But as Kahlil pointed out, right, like they should probably be talking to experts who work in their, who live and work in their communities, right? Because that's how you get to wellness.
I very much agree with you there. I very much agree with you there, Bakari, that, find those people that you already trust and have a conversation. and not necessarily a typed out conversation. Because then you can, something about us talking in person, even over Zoom, that conveys so much more than words on a page or words on a screen. But I wanted to just take a step back to what Kamel was saying about these influencers, right, and trusting them as a source. Very often, also, they may provide links, right, to other resources, and then that's your first step down the rabbit hole. You click that link, it takes you to something that reinforces what's been said, and then the next one will take you to something else, and it just continues in this way. So it would be prudent to maybe find other sources. Look up that same topic and read other viewpoints on the same topic, and then make your decision based on many different viewpoints, not just the one influencer. I think that's the. Go ahead, Reverend Ashley.
No, I'm waiting for you to finish. I was going to say that's part of being a good debate team member, right? Being a good attorney, you know both sides of the argument, and so we anticipate where it's going and what is happening with it. So this is a great conversation, and I'm appreciative that for the insights that all three of you are bringing to this topic. Talk to me about your day-to-day experiences around talking about the vaccine. What has that been like in testing and so forth? What has that been like for you?
I guess I'll jump out there first. I personally, I'm not going to beat around the bush. There's a part of me that does walk around it, trying the best I can, because I understand some levels of hesitancy.
Okay.
I want you, though, to also, if I'm bringing empathy to the table for your position, I want you to bring empathy for my position. Because my position is, it's bigger than you. A lot of people, their hesitancy is completely based on an individual perspective. The reason we're asking you to get this vaccine to be inoculated, right? Let's use a different word, because I think vaccinated has lost its weight. Inoculated, right? Is it'll help the community, right? And then we can have a conversation, because then we start getting into, oh, well, history says this. And I'm like, yes, you're right. History does say this. But what is the full context of that history? Is it medical resources being provided or medical resources being withheld? Is it experimentation before the fact or experimentation after the fact? And I think those are the questions. So before there was FDA approval and you were like, nah, they experimented on our people. Okay, we can have that conversation, right? But here's why you should, because your grandmother and your children can be exposed and there's nothing for them. Right? And now I'm not combating you. I'm not arguing with you. I'm trying to get you to see why it's bigger than me and you, right? And so what ends up happening is, like I said before, it's hard to get to that point with everyone. Most people just want to respond. So I kind of am like, I'll open the door with empathy that I understand your position, and all I'm going to say is be safe. But here's why you should. And then move from there.
Okay.
Right, and I agree. Empathy is necessary in these conversations, because people are arriving at these viewpoints from a historical perspective, from the experiences that they've had. So I think that the first step in any of these conversations is to listen. I always approach these things with curiosity, in that if a person asks me what I think about the vaccine, I'll ask them what they think about it first. Well, why don't you tell me, what are your thoughts on it? I think far too often we start from a place of maybe not listening, but trying to negate right away, concerns that people may have or viewpoints that they may have, as opposed to really listening and understanding that viewpoint and where it's coming from. So I usually start those conversations with more questions until I feel like I have enough of a feeling of what this person is experiencing and what information they do have access to before offering advice or offering what I think the solution is, which may fit my life, but not necessarily that person's life. So I think empathy and curiosity are very important.
May I share a perspective of what I've observed in
Sure.
Colombia during the course of the evolution of the pandemic? So I definitely agree that, there is the concern. When I talk to people from my university, when I've talked to, other individuals I know from Colombia,
Mhm.
there is the concern that, can we really trust the government, right? Can we really trust this vaccine coming from the government? Now, what I have observed is, because the reality of what Kahlil touched upon is some people may have historically based reasons as to why they don't trust the vaccine. Like when we look at here in the United States, the history of the medical industry, pharmaceutical industry in relation to the Black community, going back to like the Tuskegee Airmen experiments, Henrietta Lacks, all those things. So there is that historical context, but that context does not exist in Colombia, right? Because the evolution is different. Now, the mistrust comes from, okay, well, we don't trust necessarily, this particular, government. But what we do trust is we trust the medical experts of our community, right? Because their healthcare system is different. It's privatized. However, it's a lot more accessible to, the poor and working class Colombians. And so they tend to trust the process of vaccination, not because, they have some sort of faith in the institutions that are producing this vaccine, but because they trust the people who they live around, right? So, that was a common consensus that I observed when I talked to people about, the concerns of vaccination. And, people will say, okay, well, yes, this is an American vaccine. However, I think that, I've known this, this nurse, I've been going to this hospital for years. They've taken care of my grandfather. They've taken care of my mother. They're taking care of my son right now. And I know and trust my people. So I'm going to go ahead and take this vaccine. Especially given the fact that in a lot of countries in Latin America, we're very hard hit by, the consequences of the pandemic. Right now in Colombia, there is a emergent variant that is vaccine resistant, and so when we talk about the impact, when we bring it back to the original point that we began upon about like Black and Latinx communities, when you're looking at Colombia specifically, it's not those, people who are living in the middle class who live in some of the bigger cities who are going to be as hard hit. It's going to be, people who are living in, it's going to be campesinos. It's going to be peasant farmers living in the eastern half of the country who are going to be harder hit. And the consequences are going to be greater if, they are not distributed the vaccine and if they don't take it. So the trust, so just want to close it out, but the trust comes not necessarily from, the institutions. It comes from the fact that, they trust the people of their community, right? Like I'm going to listen to these health professionals who I've known since I've been a child. So yeah.
And you all three make excellent points. I know we're going to take questions and answers in just a moment from the audience, but before we do that, anything that we need to talk about that we didn't discuss that?
I think we kind of are touching on some of what the next steps need to be. Okay. In terms of how do we deal with it, right? How do we address it, right? Like, I think that's kind of been one of the themes is what now? And Bakari brought up a great point, is the people are hesitant to trust the institution, but they have the communal there to say, hey, what's going on? And I think we keep coming back to that concept. And I think that's something that here in America is frayed. And there's even more space in between those, say, doctors and the people. And that distrust is a little bit wider because there may not be a neighborhood doctor, right? I probably go to the urgent care clinic to get taken care of health-wise. And are we going to be able to have those same conversations to put me at ease? Or, when I go, because I know when I went to get vaccinated, it threw me for a loop. There was National Guardsmen, and I was like, wait a minute, like I have a historical picture where I see that, I go, wait a minute, what's really going on? So I can imagine now if somebody who's on a different level of hesitancy sees that, they might turn around and go home. And I think that's the conversations we have to have internally, both about why people, like Peter said, empathy and curiosity. Why do you feel this way? Without me trying to convince you to turn sides, just so I can understand you. Because then you can kind of understand me. And I can say, well, really, I got the shot because I have elders I care about, and I have the future I care about, who that's why I don't want to go out, because I have to go into the world and I bring it back to them. And now I'm stuck, And I think that's the other thing is we also have to be more communal because we're all experiencing so much grief. It's a constant wax and wane of mourning. Whether it's directly connected to you, 6 degrees of separation, or something you saw in the news. So that sense of community, I think, is one of the major things we have to be more comfortable with building and intentional in how we build it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I think that, our medical professionals and our medical institutions, have a responsibility to rebuild the trust, that they have lost over the years through, practices and the treatment of, our Black and brown people, so that they hesitate to go to one of these institutions, right? Or, they've had negative experiences, and so that trust needs to be built up again, through outreach and through showing people that you have their best interests at heart, not just, telling them what's best for them, which is the usual model. Here's what's best for you. Do this, do this, do this. And as you said earlier, Kamel, folks are existing in the world and they've been just fine and they've been surviving. So why should they listen to do this, do this? And on the point of grief, I mean, we are all grieving, and this is a trauma for many of us. But there's no place to process that. There's no space or time for us to get through this, through that grief and trauma. In addition to that, we've lost a lot of our normal practices for grieving. At the early part of the pandemic, there were hardly any funerals, though there were many people that were passing. And those funerals are an opportunity for communities to come together, for people to come together and process that grief together. And because of the dangers of the pandemic, it was hard for us to do that. So I think one step that people can take personally and as communities is to start that grieving process. So start talking about the loss that they've had, and support one another through healing from it.
Absolutely. Last thought before I start asking raising the questions that came in.
I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I think we also have to take maybe start talking about what people could do for themselves, right? Because we've talked a lot about going out and finding resources, but there are many things that people can do for themselves, at home, that can lead to better mental and physical health. Sleep being one of the biggest ones. It's ironic that through the pandemic we spend so much time home, but we don't sleep as much as we used to. Now that's because of the stress and all of the mental energy that we're using with worry and anxiety and all of those things. So sleep is number one. With that anxiety and worry comes perhaps some self-medication, which may help us fall asleep, but doesn't allow for us to sleep well. So although we may be sleeping, some folks may be sleeping all day, that the rest that it has to be restful sleep. And there are many things that interfere with that. Exercise, doing some calisthenics at home that will, produce that better sleep, as we exert ourselves and we use our bodies. and also socializing, talking to other people,
Mm-hmm.
having conversations,
Mm-hmm.
and not just interacting with the world, through a device, which, I know for some that is their access to the world because of where they are and perhaps the isolation that they feel. But every now and then, see if you could actually talk to a person, and have a conversation that could be fulfilling and bring up that energy level.
Absolutely.
That's just a couple of things, but
Those are all on target. And I would just add to it, not to be so voyeuristic and turn the television off. Because we get bombarded, as just all of us said, with information, and sometimes it's just too much. It's just too much. And I think that it's an assault on our body, our spirit, and our mind. And sometimes, I know I find myself watching sometimes shows I would not normally watch. Don't care the outcome. I know the X-ray is upside down. I'm going to ignore that part. I know they wouldn't normally do it this way. I got that. I understand it. But, it's no drama, no trauma, and just kind of give something, it's very predictable. It's very vanilla. I got all that. But I need predictable vanilla right now in a world of uncertainty. In a world filled of uncertainty. One of my, and I would add to all of you have said, my religious leaders, clergy folks, share the many funerals they've had to conduct under adverse conditions. Like you said, 10-minute funerals. I lost one of my members of 30 years. I had 10 minutes total to say goodbye to this person. And how do you do that in a meaningful way? You can't. And so just the frustration from my identity as clergy of not doing that which you're familiar with and handling those kinds of pieces. So I was asked a specific question. I'm going to universalize it. I teach at 3 different places. So I'm not going to pick on any one institution. I'm going to ask the question, do you feel higher education is handling this well?
I
Okay,
think,
I'm sorry.
oh, go ahead, Bakari.
Okay, I think that I graduated from Central State University in Ohio after I finished at Kingsborough. And I see a lot of the information about like the events and initiatives that my institution has taken. And being that I currently attend La Javeriana in Colombia, I can say from what I've observed through social media, I think that my institutions, both Kingsborough as well as Central State, have done an excellent job in terms of outreach, in terms of providing access to, professionals. And in La Javeriana, the difference being that it's a much larger institution than my university, Central State. Um, it has an incredible amount of resources. And what I've observed in Colombia is, they will take the whole entire soccer stadium, and they will turn that into, just massive area where people can get access to resources, access to professionals, and things of that nature. So I think that in terms of education from both, the domestic as well as from the foreign perspective, from what I've observed, a little bit I've observed, I think that the institutions are doing a great job. Higher ed, I think, is going to always be the key institution because, that is where a lot of people are educated. That is where they have a lot of resources and they have a lot of vested interest in the community, right? The communities that whatever university is located in. And they have a lot of the experts. So it makes sense. It makes sense from just that perspective that it would naturally flow that educational institutions who have the experts, who have the resources, would be able to cater to their community. I hope I'm not the only one who feels that way.
We're going to find out.
Um, I personally think that higher education has done a good job in terms of the old paradigm. What I think is that beyond higher education, just in terms of how we operate in our political sphere, in our educational sphere, in our social sphere, we have to start to consider a shift in how we view everything, a change in our paradigm so that we can serve all the people coming out of this. Because we saw the the weak points in the chain of the old way once this pandemic hit. And I think if we're trying to go back to that, then yes, everyone is doing a good job. But I think we have to also have a level of courage. And I think this goes beyond higher education, because I think right now institutions are doing what they can do within the model they've been given. We have to figure out, how do we change that model? Because there is more we could do, but we have to also be empowered to do more. And that comes from people beyond us.
And that's a great point, Kamel. And that was something, as I was contemplating my answer, I was thinking that they're doing the best that they can for now. And there's definitely an evolution that's necessary. And some of that is going back to before this paradigm, right? The more in-person touch, calling people on the phone as opposed to emails. And I know that we can't call every, all 10, 12,000 students that are at the college, but the ones that we know are not connecting, the ones that we haven't heard from, because I think that personal touch can do a lot, to pull someone out of, a bad place they might be in, and show that the care is real. And I think that has happened at Kingsborough and CUNY over time, but it was a process, and it took a while to get there, because the faculty and staff, were dealing with the pandemic as well, and trying to figure out ways how they can do what they do in new ways. But now we're at a place where I think people are comfortable with that, so it's time for the next step.
Go ahead. We have roughly 10 minutes left. So what are you going to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, Camilla, I wanted to touch upon your point. I think you made a fantastic point about changing the model. So when you're talking about, and let's take it back to the original point of our communities. So with the lack of resources that we may have in our communities, what steps do you think we can take in terms of organizing to assist our institutions like Kingsborough, like Central State University in Ohio, which is a HBCU university? How do we go about organizing effectively so that we can help them gain the resources they need to change that model? What do you think would be some good first steps?
So I'm of the old-fashioned grassroots belief. I think no matter what you want to do, you start from the bottom. I think we've transitioned where we always think it has to come from the top down, and that hurts us as communities. Even if it's just 5 of your friends from the block, that's 5 people you've got ready to organize and do what needs to be done. The first thing is ask the community what it needs. So if it's you're helping Kingsborough, you go. If it's President Strader you need to talk to, whichever area you want to help, find the person who you think will be your most effective ear and say, what do you need? And if you only got 5 people, hey, you only got 5 people. That limits what you can do, but that's how you have to start. Because what I've seen from my years in college, I went to Binghamton University. I lived in Binghamton for 18 years. And I did a lot of grassroots work. And what we saw was when I was working for some nonprofits and working with certain orgs, and we went and said, this is what you need, the community was like, whatever. But when we said, hey, what do you need? And they're like, well, we need this. And you start organizing around that 5 grows to 10, to 20, to 40. And it constantly builds, because then people go, I see the benefit. And I think that's something we have to do in terms of even dealing with this pandemic. When it first started and people were creating community fridges and, going around checking on elders, those community initiatives really took off. You saw a growing communal sense, which is why the protests were so large in response to injustice. But as time went on, because we were being told to shift kind of back to the old model, we lost some of that desire to be communal, because now our time was, I got to go to work. I got to get the kids ready. I got to do this, that. And now all those things started compounding again, instead of how can my neighbor help me? How can I help the lady across the street? How can we build together and then grow from there? But that would be my first response, is ask whoever you want to help what they need, and not in a way that makes them feel less than or deficient, but that will eventually empower them.
Yeah. I'm a zillion% behind you on that. And I've been sitting here trying to resist the urge to say, I have a new book, and that's actually in my book.
Yeah.
So no, totally. I mean, we have to get back to this sense of organizing as communities and as a collective, and understanding that individually we get picked off, collectively we can make a difference in our communities. And I think the pandemic has given us the I guess the roadmap, or it's taken the veil, or say, let's go back to that concept that it worked so effectively that folks worked triple time to dismantle the concept of organizing our communities. We need to reclaim that, because it is effective. It does work. And you're right. Asking what do you need versus I'm the resident expert, I'm going to tell you what you need. This question with 5 minutes comes up, and it says, share our social media and you can ask any new books. Okay, so I can share it. I have a brand new book. It's a month old. It's called New Rules for Radicals. It's an update from the old Saul Alinsky book, Rules for Radicals, 50 years later, but talking about racism and how it impacts and changes the conversation. And so someone had asked, for the moderator, how do we spiritually heal from the problem? I'm glad you asked that. And I think we go back to the biblical themes, or the spiritual themes, if you will. I've been doing support groups for the last 18 months around the globe for religious leaders and religious conversations to talk about lament, which we kind of talked around, and to understand that that's in sacred literature, that you do cry, that you do lament the loss of identity. You do lament the loss of our freedom, if you will. And it's talk about the losses, which you had mentioned during the panel, that there are a tremendous amount of losses. And you're right, Peter, we need places to process those losses, to deal with the grief. And the Kubler-Ross family allowed one of the scholars to add another number 6 to the grief process, where they talk about finding meaning. And I know as an analyst, as a professor, as a pastor, people are trying to find meaning out of all of this, and to help, not to give the answers, but to create safe avenues to look at and reflect upon meaning. And I think the last thing from a spiritual standpoint is love, being able to love yourself, to have a new love affair with yourself, and to find, there's a lot of good stuff about me. There's a lot of positives. Yes, I'm going to see Peter or Will on lay on the couch and talk about all the issues and stuff. But I got some ego things I need to look at. I need to be affirmed. And particularly in Black and brown communities where we're assaulted all the time, we need the affirmation. Time left. Please, the rest of you, jump in. Your books, your social media. How do we get in touch with you? How do we know how to reach out to you? Because you're bringing some stuff to the table that we need to hear.
I saw a question in chat that I just wanted to touch on for 30 seconds. I think in regards to the mandates and things of that nature, before you drove a car, you got a license.
Mm-hmm.
Before you got a job, you had to prove to these people you were valuable enough for them to hire you.
Yeah. And
I think that another fact that we have to talk about, since we're talking about race, is where the pushback began with a lot of these mandates. The concept of when whiteness is inconvenienced, how it is allowed to respond versus when Black folks are inconvenienced, how they're allowed to respond. And I think right now, what ends up happening is we're mixing apples and oranges in terms of how we're dealing with these mandates. And I'm not one who believes you should, have to do everything you're told. But however, there's a point where why is this the point you pushed against versus some other opportunities? Because you want to push back against mandates. Are you also pushing that same for equitable wages and living rates? Are you pushing that same for people to have housing and food to address those insecurities? Or are you just mad because your job is inconvenienced, but you could still take the L of losing a job?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a different conversation. And we have to be very mindful of how we add race into that conversation, because there's two different things happening at the same time, trying to be conflated into the same thing. Because there are some people saying, I want more resources for being asked to do more. And some people saying, I'm inconvenienced, and therefore I'm going to throw a temper tantrum. Two totally different things.
I'm doing a holy dance. if not physically, spiritually, and mentally. Thank you so much. You are so on target with that. Last word.
Empathy.
Empathy.
Organization.
Organization.
And I guess I'll go back to curiosity.
Curiosity.
And, just being
Empathy,
curious about other people's experiences.
Empathy, organization, curiosity. There we have it. Thank you each for this conversation. I wish we could go on long, because this has really been a needed conversation, and I think this is going to help a lot of people. And so thank you. That's all I can say is thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Ashley.
Yes, thank you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
All right, thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. We're at the time. Reverend Ashley, thank you for leading us in this important conversation. And there are a few things that I think we certainly could recap. I don't want to take too much time, but a couple of things I want to highlight that the panelists said. Willard, Peter, Kamel, Bakari, talking about the importance of not self-medicating in those moments when you are feeling the stress and the pressure of the emotional toil of being in these moments. Sometimes it's hard to lean into those moments of emotional toil, but because we're not used to having vacuums, right? We're not used to having space that's empty where we have to actually process. We'd like to fill our spaces with distractions, social media, phones, TV. So turning off the TV, having important conversations with loved ones that you need to have with, and also just being aware that sometimes we try to medicate with something as simple as wine, or people take edibles all the time, or things that are just making them feel like, oh, this is just taking the edge off a little bit. But what you might be doing is running away from the actual ability for you to tap in to that energy and the actual emotional resourcefulness that is available inside of you. Also, use professionals that are available that were mentioned. Some resources were mentioned here. Reverend Ashley, your book, I already ordered it on my Amazon just now. So it'll be coming in a few days. So excited for what you're doing here. Thank you all for being a part of this. Folks, stay tuned. We're going to have our next panel start in about 15 minutes, which is our noon panel titled Mental Health Resourcefulness for CUNY Undocumented Students and Families Through the Pandemic. So for the panelists here, thank you so much. And for those who are watching, stay tuned. Bring a friend on to register and come join us for the next hour from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you soon. Have a great time. And thanks so much, panelists, again, for being here with us today.